Well, I figure we'll try something a little bit different today. How dads just say, sometimes you just gotta get out of the basement. It always confused me at the time. We didn't have a basement. Well, the king is dead. Long live the king. We finally get to see Hal all grown up. King Henry V. What kind of king is he gonna be? Will all that gallivanting around with drunks and prostitutes pay off? Will he be a just king, a good king, a merciful king? Or a tyrant, hothead, careless for his subjects, interested only in his own divine right? The center of this play is really the Battle of Agincourt, but how it gets represented is really important. Here's the history, here's the data. Henry, the new king, finds a legal loophole that might give him some claim to the French throne. At the very least, he might be able to recapture some of the land that was lost to his ancestors. Remember, we did a quick dirty history on this. John, the brother of Richard the Lionheart, loses all the Plantagenet lands held in France. Edward III, Hal's great-grandfather, launched a campaign to regain it. This is called the 100 Years' War. And this moves by fits and starts across the reigns of Richard II and Henry IV. But now, with some legal cover and a new sense of his own divine authority and the backing of all his nobles, the front in France is looking pretty sweet. He shows up with an army and hoofs it across northern France until he meets the larger and more heavily armed French powers at Agincourt. There's actually a lot of historical data on the battle itself. Eyewitness accounts, archaeological evidence, death records, all kinds of things. I won't bore you with strategies and details and that kind of stuff, but the result is this. The French get butchered. Conservative estimates put it about 6,000 losses. It's about half the army. A ton of those were French nobles, dukes, barons, knights, not just farmers with rakes and stuff. There's a couple of ways we might read this. On the one hand, there's something of class warfare here. Remember, before the battle, Shakespeare has Hal walking around in disguise, talking with all the normies on the front lines. There's a lot of rumination on the role of kings and their right to send regular folks to die in battles that has nothing to do with them. Henry's forces are outmatched and, frankly, outclassed, but somehow that road-weary ragtag rabble led by a handful of nobles and captains are able to slaughter the overconfident, aristocratic, wealthy French. God, in this reading, favors the just, not the rich. In the same way, this play might be interested in deconstructing that hierarchy altogether. Before the battle, Henry gives this bonkers motivational speech that rallies the troops. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. There's no difference at heart between Henry the King, the divine, supernatural angel of God's authority, and Pistol, for crying out loud, the most obnoxious, uncouth loudmouth among them. He today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he never so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. It's all about social elevation. It affirms one's ability to resist the fetters social hierarchies lock us into. This is Hal, the king, at the top of the whole chain, saying there's room up here. He's using his privilege to hold the door open for others. On the other hand, this is all covering the events that really happened at Agincourt. Historically, it's long been held that the English carried the day simply because they had more suitable weapons. The English came equipped with a new kind of longbow that was easier to load, more accurate, had greater range. Somewhere around 80% of the English forces were archers. It's upwards of about 6,000 people. Each archer held about 70 arrows and could send off a shot about once every 10 seconds. The battle itself is pretty short. It's about 3 hours, the longest estimate. So do the math. That's a volley of about 2,500 arrows per minute. The French didn't stand a chance. They couldn't even get close. On this reading, what won the battle was nothing other than new technology. The French were basically bringing a knife to a gunfight. How we tell the story shows a lot about how we understand the world. Is all this stuff just the orderings of divine OCD that puts everything into its proper place? The proper recompense for overweening pride and mistimed jokes about tennis balls? Or is it leveling the class-based playing field and putting the groundlings up in the rafters with the nobles? Or is it merely that science fiction staple that the most technologically advanced forces will win, right or wrong? I'm not here to say either way. My point is this: history is always locked in a narrative. As literary scholars, we know that narrative is the vehicle for ideologies. It's the megaphone for institutions of power that write and rewrite the boundaries of acceptable thought and action. When we see a series of conflicting narratives, we don't have to choose one over the other. Instead, we can ask, who says? For what purpose? What does this narrative authorize? What does it disallow? We deconstruct these narratives to trace power to its hiding places. One way we might do that is to read out of the political theology surrounding knighthood at the time. Background comes from a couple of modern theorists, Carl Schmidt's book called Political Theology, and Ernst Kantorowicz's book, The King's Two Bodies. These are both a bit older, really easy to find and get a hold of online if you're interested. As the name implies, political theology explores the relationship between politics and theology, or more specifically, the ways that Protestant theology is used to justify and maintain sovereignty, in which political systems co-opt theological language, thereby imbuing themselves with transcendent divine authority. This really, in many ways, lends legitimacy to all our political systems, even today. We don't have kings or divine rights or great chains of being anymore, but just look at how many of our political institutions of power clothe themselves in religious language. Think about how often that verse in Romans is trotted out: submit yourselves to authority, to mollify or even shame political dissent, or how many times people refer to presidents as God's anointed. Yikes. Sovereignty, rule, power, authority, really all forms of vertically structured mastery that raise one person over against another authorize itself through the appropriation of theological language and ideas, applied not to God, where they rightly belong, but to people, which we would usually call idolatry. The irony, of course, is that all this secularization of divine authority completely nullifies the incarnation, but that's getting us to theology proper. We'll save that for another time. So simply, political theology is the secularization of divine authority applied to state apparatuses. Ernst Kantorowicz refined this more general theory by applying it to English royal systems, especially looking at the Tudor monarchs. Elizabeth was a Tudor, the last Tudor, in fact. English sovereignty was authorized by two intersecting beliefs. First, the sovereignty of the king on earth was granted by his relationship to the king of heaven. So Elizabeth, James, Henry was all representative of Jesus, and the state's authority was an extension of Jesus' authority. Second, and this is where Kantorowicz really contributes to the picture, the authority of the English crown extended to the position of the king, more than simply the person of the king. English sovereignty was read through the fiction of the two bodies of the king. The figure of the king stands in for the political body of the state, while the natural body of the king, the man himself, may change. So the famous saying, "The king is dead, long live the king." Kantorowicz used the language of theater and stage as a metaphor for this fluid transfer of power from monarch to monarch. The king embodies this power as an actor embodies a theatrical role. Now, it's important to note here, the role the king plays has nothing to do with character. The only trait associated with this role is that the person has authority. An evil person, a good person, a weak person, a strong person, whatever, could be cast in this role. What a tyrant and a paragon or even an elected official have in common is they are all authorized to wield power. Now, the stakes get a bit higher after the English Reformation. See, when England was Catholic before the Reformation, as was in Henry V's time, power is divided between civil and religious institutions. King rules citizens' body, but the church manages their souls. In an important way, then, the king, as just another man playing a theatrical role, was subject to the church. In another way, the church, as it was comprised of citizens, was subject to the crown. This makes something of a balance between two powerful authorities. Kind of. I mean, none of this really matters to poor Joe Farmer aside from the ideological baggage. He goes to church, pays his taxes either way. Anyways, it all threatens to come crashing down when Henry VIII, Elizabeth's dad, breaks from the Catholic Church. It's complicated. See, Henry VIII needs an heir. His current wife, Catherine of Aragon, Catholic Princess of Spain, can't bear him one, so he goes seeking an annulment from the Pope. But look, Hank, your marriage is not just for granting you sons, it's also the basis of an uneasy peace between England and really all of Europe. If you cut off Catherine, you're going to make it really hard for the Pope. But on the other hand, this Protestant Reformation thing is going off like gangbusters all over Europe. The main powers, king and church, are still Catholic, sure, but they're in a real crisis of legitimacy. In fact, England has become something of a safe haven for a lot of European reformers. They won't be executed there, at least. And the Protestant population there is really starting to inflate. And as a bonus, the vast network of cathedrals across England was loaded with money, land, power. So, 1534, Henry cuts off the Pope entirely, declared the head of the Church of England, ransacks churches all over the country, and ends up with power and wealth beyond his wildest dreams. Plus, he can divorce whoever he wants. No big deal. But for political theology, this is a big deal. The move essentially recasts Crown as the sole actor in the play of sovereignty. Kind of a one-man show. Even though there were other powerful figures floating around, consolidating religious and civil authority in one figure, the king, put that position on a completely different level. So Kantorowicz says, the king in this new role was a personification in its own right, which was not only above its members, but also divorced from them, which bore all the features and attributes of an angel or other supernatural being. It's pretty up there. In this recast play of sovereignty, power, all other powers, including the church, had only subordinate parts. All of this background is important because this is the idea of sovereignty Shakespeare would be working under. These are the assumptions. This is the cultural inheritance, the social imaginary that his audience at the Globe would already be versed in. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Shakespeare is writing a play about the king for a world that sees the figure of the monarch as an actor playing a role of the sovereign. So we have an actor playing the part of Hal, who's stepping in the role of the king. Later, when Shakespeare's company performed this play at the Royal Court for King James himself, the levels of meta must have been off the charts. Actors acting sovereignty for the new sovereign, actor acting king. In all this meta role play, then, what we're getting is something like a rarefied, abstracted idea of kingship. That would make sense, too, if this play's use of the chorus, a layover from classical drama. If Henry IV Part 1 is historical fiction, and Henry IV Part 2 is allegory, it would make sense to say Henry V aspires to the level of mythology. The first, a particular story, the second, a particular made universal, and the third is a universal made particular. Maybe what we're seeing is what divine kinghood, that powerful role with the attributes of an angel, is supposed to be in this world of political theology, for good or ill. All that means when we read Henry V, we can read it as a text in dialogue with the structures of sovereignty. How that dialogue works, whether it's subversive, whether it merely toes the line of the status quo, is really up to our interpretation. Because the truth is that a literary text is polysemic. There are a multitude of perspectives that it strives to represent. And so there's a multitude of voices that try to lay hold of it. The job of the critic, the literary critic, the new historicist critic, is to find the most appropriate way to deploy this history right now. But I would add that in our interpretations, we need to come face to face with the assumption of authority and sovereignty that underwrite our own moment as well. It's easy to look at the past and say, oh, Shakespeare's working against this, or he's the mouthpiece of that. We often forget that we aren't free of political theology either. And even though we may not lock all civil and religious authority in the figure of one person, I mean, most of us anyway, our interpretations, our assumptions, our social imaginary also has the residue of our own interactions with power on it. Maybe one of the things this meta role-playing accumulation of the king playing the king does for us is that it gives us the leverage to think about sovereignty in any context. And maybe that's the reason we're still reading this play. For me, the most compelling elements are when Henry drops the kingly stuff and shows real concern for his people. When he sticks up for Fluellen, or prays in fear before the battle, or even wooing Catherine. Guy can't speak French, I sympathize. For me, the thing that stands out is the fluidity with which Henry changes in and out of his roles. Is this to say maybe the roles we play don't have to be simplistic or totalizing? Maybe we can be many things at once, play a series of roles rather than fragmented identities? If Henry could be king and brother and foot soldier and lover, maybe I can be teacher and student and neighbor and father. Maybe it's not about reinforcing the role of sovereign, or the naive thought that we could easily shrug it off like an ill-fitting disguise. Maybe it's to say that all our roles, even the highest roles, are less than who we are.